All right. Good afternoon, or good evening, or good morning, whoever you are, wherever you are. This is Dr. Patrick Lockwood coming back to you live to continue on in my four-part series on adaptive group identification. This is the concept that I believe I came up with. And again, I'll issue the same statement I've made in the previous two videos. If someone can find another author, a researcher, a philosopher, a YouTuber, whomever, who has talked about this concept as I've named it before I've talked about it, let me know. And I will rescind everything I'm saying in terms of it being uniquely mine. I'm pretty sure this concept is mine. Could be wrong. So I want to continue on this talk, and I want to talk about the concept of religion. And how important is it to identify with your religion? I think this is a very important discussion to have because we live in a fairly religious world. You know, over half the population on the planet belongs to some form of Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, basically. So it's a pretty big topic, and it's a pretty old topic. It's thousands of years old. So I think it's important to figure out, well, how useful is it exactly to focus on and identify with your religion? How big of a slice of the pie of your identity should your religion be, if you're religious at all? So I think that's the main focus today, and I hope to speak very honestly about what the research says about religion and how useful it is to focus on and hone in on your religion. So I'm going to be pulling from a lot of studies. I have over 80 cited here in this talk. And there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles on religion, its various uses, consequences, etc. Again, if you're looking for great pro-religion arguments, you can go talk to people like, or listen to people like Ben Shapiro and, you know, all the great religious people, speakers in the last 30, 40 years. They'll give you a great kind of compelling argument as to why religion is useful, ethical, moral, whatever. So again, Dennis Prager, Ben Shapiro, and there are different kinds of thinkers. You can find them all on YouTube. And then if you want the anti-religion argument, you can go to people like Sam Harris or the late great Christopher Hitchens or Richard Dawkins, any number of people in the atheist camp, Michael Shermer, for instance. My goal here today is not to pick one of those sides. My goal is to be a little more like Brett Weinstein, even though I could never be nearly as articulate or smart as Brett Weinstein. My goal is to basically say, this is the adaptive value, essentially. And I believe I've heard Brett Weinstein make one kind of overture in that way during one of his talks. I think it was the podcast with Sam Harris, Ben Shapiro, and himself. Or it might have been another one. Anyways, so today we're going to talk about religion. We're going to talk about a concept called religiosity. We're going to talk about how religious we are, and then what the research says in psychology and sociology about how it is adaptive or not adaptive, how it hurts us, helps us, does not. So some quick updates. The book's still coming out, The Fear Problem, where I first introduced this concept and first discussed it and thought about it about 2 years ago. It's coming out October 2nd. Thank you again to Mascot Books for all of your help in making this happen. It's been a very interesting journey, and they have made it as smooth as they possibly can, and that's very, very much appreciated. So October 2nd, The Fear Problem is coming out. Other updates, Part 4 coming up next week, politics. But for now, let's talk about religion. So why am I talking about religion in terms of adaptive group identity? Like, why is this an important focus? Because I could be going after so many things like sexuality, or I could be going after belief in communism or economic philosophy or other things. Well, Again, the late, great Christopher Hitchens once wrote a book with the subtitle, How Religion Poisons Everything. Now, again, that's not the argument I'm here to make. However, I do believe, and the research supports, that religious movements influence pretty much every facet of organized life. And they have for about the last 2,000 years or greater. And if you listen to people like Jordan Peterson and Eric Weinstein, both of whom are very intellectual and live in very different sides of political and social and different perspectives, it seems as if there is some kind of place in our mind and in society for a concept like religion or spirituality. And the problem is we're just not quite sure to what degree something like religion or spirituality is optimal for human health and human functioning, right? We're just not perfectly sure. Now, maybe in the last couple of debates or podcasts between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, they figured this out. I haven't watched, I have no clue what they're talking about. Maybe they have, maybe they haven't. But I think the best place for us to start to figure out how useful identifying with religion is for you is with a concept called religiosity, which has been highly researched for the past 30 or 40 years. So I think it's a good proxy for how strongly we identify with our religion or our religious tribe and how it can be used in my adaptive group identification framework that I'll talk about later. But for now, let's just talk about what the research says about religiosity. So religiosity, again, is a very complex concept at least in the psychology world, because again, psychology takes a very simple thing and it makes it about 1,000 different things because, you know, we're a lost science. However, what has happened here is there's a basic broad definition of religiosity, and then there are a bunch of subcomponents and more specific definitions of religiosity. So basically, the broad definition of religiosity is kind of the intensity of our belief in and participation in our religious system. That's not very complicated at all. However, other authors break it down a little bit more into subcomponents like social religiosity or private and public religiosity. So how religious I am in private, how much I think about God or my principles in private versus how much to talk about them in public. They break it down into individual religiosity. They break it up into gratitude. They break it into, you know, how you view God's will or how you view God or, you know, judgmentality or all that kind of stuff. I say for the sake of being simplistic, not to mislead anyone, just for the sake of being simplistic, let's just say for the sake of argument, a lot of what I'm talking about here going forward is the broad definition of the intensity with which we identify with our religion and participate in it. That's all. That's religiosity. So let's talk about what the research actually says about religiosity. So according to one meta-analysis in 2003, basically, prior to 2003, according to this meta-analysis, the psychology world has really struggled to identify and understand religiosity because so many people have so many different definitions of religion. So there's been, just as a caveat for everyone, some of what I'll be pulling from here comes from confused definitions. So it's not perfectly clear what does what or what causes what or what relates to what. And because they haven't had consistent definitions, this is one of the reasons why there haven't been as many consistent findings in the research literature. That's what this study says. So this particular study showed that 15 years ago, there was an overall positive relationship between the degree of religiosity, on one hand, and mental health. So the more religious you were, the better your mental health was. That's this one meta-analysis. Furthermore, this concept called institutional religiosity, so the extent to which you like kind of concrete, hard and fast rules and all that stuff in your religion, to rigidly adhere to religion, so to speak, as opposed to personal religiosity, which is just like, it's important that I think God exists or whatever. Institutional religiosity is correlated with worse mental health. So the more rigid you are about your religion and your religiosity, the worse your mental health is. This is just one study. Then another study, a later study from the American Journal of Psychiatry, showed that there are two components of religiosity. You know, the social component, I talk about it, I hang out with other religious people, and then gratitude, that are associated with reduced risk for mental illness. So the community side of religion and the gratitude side of religion reduces the risk for mental illness. Whereas 4 factors actually reduce risk for only aggressive behavior. So general religiosity, God being part of their life, forgiveness, and God as judge. And then only 1 factor with reduced risk for internalizing disorders, so like unvengefulness, God being unvengeful, loving and forgiving. There's a reduced risk for like anxiety, for instance. That's one kind of in the pro-religion, pro-religiosity column, breaking it down by specific facets of religion. So again, that's 2 different studies with 2 different sets of outcomes. You're going to notice a trend that's very similar going forward. So other research shows that how we develop a religious identity goes through a variety of stages, basically. So you could look at it through kind of Erickson's stages of identity diffusion, foreclosure, moratorium, and achievement. Or you could talk about it through kind of the race-based identity development model, which is like religion as a ascribed identity, religion as a chosen identity, and religion as a declared identity. And basically some research promotes the idea that, you know, religiosity is kind of like a religious self. So like the higher we are on religiosity, the kind of the bigger the slice of a pie of ourself contains religion. Authors basically show, in a lot of the articles I read here and I'm citing here, that across all religions, all cultures, the more your religious beliefs are challenged, the higher your religiosity makes you actually more reactive. So the higher you score on measures of religiosity, when you're in the context or the circumstance of your religion being challenged, the more emotionally reactive you become. That's across most studies for the last 30 years. So this is one flag I want to plant real quick before we move on. This is one of those things that really kind of definitively supports one of my arguments about adaptive group identity. The more religious you are, the more emotionally volatile you become when people challenge your identity. This is important because this goes into like how useful is it to identify that way. Just remember that I said this, and we'll come back to it. More research. Research shows that across adolescence, you know, religious identity remains mostly stable, but religious participation declines as they get closer to 18, 19, and 20. Other research shows that identity status, religious identity status, in adolescence is more contextually focused, in the sense that if your community emphasizes strongly identifying as a religious person, then teens turn out to be more religious. So if you come from a highly religious culture, teens tend to be a little bit more religious. It's not too complicated. We're social creatures. Let's talk about other age groups, the elderly. So research shows that the elderly, as they become more religious, they experience less depression and have increased self-esteem. Interesting. Some religious groups feel stigmatized. Researchers assert that you can actually integrate your religious identity with typically antithetical concepts like the LGBT sexual identity or something else kind of abhorred in the Bible through a process called integration, which is really mental trickery to compartmentalize. So basically the research shows that you can be gay and religious at the same time, when in reality, I'm going to plant another flag right now that if you are a highly devout religious person and you've actually read the Bible, the Quran, and other religious books, it's going to be very, very difficult to be perfectly, healthily integrated into that culture because one says you're bad. So your religion typically says you're bad. It's kind of weird. I don't get people like Milo Yiannopoulos who say, I can be a Catholic and I can be gay and proud. It's like, but Catholicism is not exactly a friend to gay people, right? That's one of the guiding kind of principles that Hitler used to objectify and kill and murder and discriminate against gay people. But anyways, Just a side note that researchers are trying to integrate two things, but one of these things is not like the other. Your private religiosity is greater correlated with your engagement in ethical behavior than your external or publicly shared religious views. So what the research shows is that the extent to which you personally, privately identify with your religion and focus on it is actually more predictive of how ethical you are in terms of your religion than how much you talk about your religion to other people, right? This is why there's this nice kind of paradox between, pretty kind of gross looking religious people on TV and on the internet who do sick, manipulative, shystery, greedy, adulterous things, but at the same time, they probably don't have much of a strong internal private experience, right? They don't match up because it's really more of a show. Another comprehensive meta-analysis showed that the more religious you are, the longer you tend to live, especially in Western cultures. And another comprehensive study showed that higher scores on religiosity were correlated with higher self-esteem and better kind of life adjustment, which was really kind of mediated by how religious or open to religion the culture was. So if you live in a highly religious culture and you're more religious as a person, then you have higher self-esteem and you have better adjustment in that culture. Moreover, another study in the American Journal of Psychiatry showed that the higher you are in terms of religiosity, the higher you score on measures of religiosity, is correlated with the decreased risk of having a depressive episode, which I think is phenomenal, right? So on the one hand, being religious and highly religious, identifying with your religion, actually is protective against stress and depression and helps you integrate into culture, especially if you're in a religious culture. Research also shows that depending upon which Christian sect of which you're a member, you'll be more or less generous. With Catholics, apparently less generous in laboratory studies, whereas Baptists and other kind of Christians in that camp are more generous. And I can't wait for the hate mail on this, but the reality is there's a little bit of research that shows that Catholics are a little less generous. Don't know why. In the US in particular, more people score higher on measures of religiosity, whereas people in Europe tend to score lower. Interesting. Apparently, according to the research, Christians tend to cope more individualistically, whereas Muslims tend to cope more collectively, right? So there's two different coping strategies based upon how you're kind of religiously oriented. These are all just a variety of facts that I'm going to use to build an argument for how adaptive religious identity is later. So just bear with me. Also, religiosity appears to be correlated with being less open-minded. So the higher you score on measures of religiosity, the less open-minded you are, and the less flexible you are in your thought style. Religiosity in teens appears to have a mixed impact on mental health, substance use, and health behaviors, like safe sex, which varies depending upon whether it's private or public religiosity. Though generally speaking, the research shows that higher scores of religiosity for teens tend to have more protective health effects. For instance, one study showed a few findings that higher private religiosity, internal religiosity scores were correlated with not having suicidal thoughts or attempts, whereas higher public religiosity was correlated with more frequent drug abuse. Interesting research for teens. Whereas in other studies, the substance abuse correlation has been kind of contradicted. So many of the research kind of programs in the last 30 years consistently track religiosity and teen substance use. And what they show is that, basically speaking, the higher a teen scores on measures of religiosity, the less likely they are to engage in substance abuse behaviors. Not surprisingly, especially if you're kind of in the Christopher Hitchens camp of atheism, the higher you score on measures of religiosity, the less likely you are to have sex as a teenager, and the more likely you are to use condoms. Also, religiosity apparently decreases the onset of first sexual intercourse in females. Another cool study in 2006 surveyed 53 countries and found that frequent churchgoers were more active in volunteer work. And that if you lived in a country or a culture that was more devout, that kind of bolstered the effect. So basically, one of the long-standing correlations in the literature is that religious people tend to engage in volunteering more, especially if they come from religiously devout nations. However, according to this study, the difference between secular and religious people is substantially smaller in devout countries than in secular countries. So basically, if you come from a religiously devout country, it's not really that big a deal. But if you come from a secular country, it's a really big deal that you're volunteering. Moreover, another great study, because it was so kind of fascinating in my mind, showed that your attachment style, whether you're insecure, ambivalent, dismissive, fearful, or not, and your personality style was more predictive of how you see God than your actual level of religiosity. So if you see God, if you have this insecure, anxious attachment, you're going to see God as this vacillating creature. If you have this dismissive attachment, you're going to see God as this judgmental, all-knowing creature. It's interesting, which has nothing to do with your religiosity. So how you see God isn't dependent upon, how much you actually care about religion. Another cross-cultural study showed that religiosity predicts life satisfaction, and that highly religious people tend to have high levels of life satisfaction, especially if they live in countries where being religious is a good thing, or if they live in collectivistic countries. However, if you live in highly secular countries, or if you live in highly individualistic countries, religiosity does not predict life satisfaction as much. So basically speaking, higher religiosity is protective against all sorts of stress, depression, substance use for all age groups if you live in a highly religious culture or a highly collectivistic culture. If you live in a more individualistic culture and you live in a more secular culture, it's not as protective. In the US, for instance, according to the research, higher religiosity is correlated with less violence or fighting and less intimate partner violence, so less spousal abuse, especially if you're from a Christian denomination, right? So apparently religiosity is a really good thing here in the US in particular, which not surprising. And now it is time to say the things that are going to be racist sounding, hateful. If you are hoping to call me a name as you're watching this video and you're looking for an opportunity to be angry with something I'm saying, here's the moment for you to get upset. So just pay attention. And I'm going to say as many things that sound inflammatory but are just research statements as possible. So, a study in 2014 done in Germany showed that the Muslim immigrant Turks showed lower ratings of gender equality than Christians of Germany. This is a marker for sexism broadly, which was moderated by the level of religiosity. So if you're a Muslim immigrant in Germany in 2014, if you're higher on scores of level of religiosity, then you were less interested in gender equality compared to German Christians. Just comparative research, that's all it is. Since I probably already sound pretty anti-Islamic or whatever, let's keep the train rolling. So another study in the Journal of Peace Research, of all places, showed that the higher religiosity among both Muslims and Jews is correlated with supporting religious terrorism. And this is mediated by what they call deprivation and psychological resource laws. So what this means, what this study done in Palestine and in Israel showed, is that the more religious you are in these two particular faiths, in this culture, and you're being persecuted, the more okay it is to go murder people because religion supports it. So there's like 4 different variables there But the linchpin variable, the one that kind of mediates the whole thing, is the fact that you're involved in religion in the first place. And then the second most important variable is the level of religiosity. So the more religious you are, the more you're okay with violence in the name of God. To me, this sounds a lot like Tribalism 101. That's why I'm having this talk with you guys. And then a study that came out this year in the Journal of Terrorism and Political Violence, that's a journal name, believe it or not, this study showed that religiosity is correlated with religious violence across 71 different countries, especially outside of Western areas. Moreover, a study conducted with people living in Israel and Palestine showed that the more political or religious violence that occurs, the more people increase on measures of religiosity. So let me say that again, so it's perfectly clear to everyone. There are many studies that talk about violence and religion. And one of the common findings is that the more political or religious violence that occurs, the more religious people become in these areas that are full of high conflict. Why? Because it helps you to have a sense of certainty, and it's a good rationale for going to do the things you want to do to get revenge. So basically, based upon these studies I've talked about so far, there is this never-ending cycle if you live in a highly religious, highly collectivistic, highly conflict-ridden area like Israel, Palestine, the Middle East, broadly speaking, where there's this never-ending cycle of it's us versus them, and the more you attack me, the more religious I become, which means the more black and white thinking and the less critical thinking I do, which means the more angry I get, which means the more I want to hurt you, which means the more you want to hurt me, which means the more religious you become, and on and on and on. And it never goes away. This is the whole point of my book. I mean, not the whole point, but this is one of my main points, is that there's this never-ending cycle that's going nowhere. Moreover, in another study, in the journal, The Psychology of Violence, that's the name of the journal, it showed that the higher you score on measures of religiosity is correlated with higher certainty in how things are, which means no critical thinking, no skepticism, which is correlated with favoring violence. Isn't that interesting? Another study conducted in Egypt, of all places, showed that higher scores on religiosity were correlated with more female intimate partner violence. So in certain cultures, the more religiously you identify, the more likely you are to engage in, I don't know, violence against women, apparently. It's one study in one culture, but these have been replicated in other places. Sadly, the general trend in the literature for the last 20 years is that the higher you score on measures of religiosity is correlated with a lower IQ. Broadly speaking, now that's not about spirituality, that's religiosity, as in how strongly you identify with a set of principles from a book. Broadly speaking, religious people tend to more consistently hold illogical, negative views of other religions, gays, and other races. Finally, when religious identities are threatened, the experimental research shows that religious people dig in their heels more than secular people or other kinds of individuals because of the threat to their religious identity. So overall, if I haven't lost any of you yet, if you're willing to listen for another 5 minutes, the higher you score in measures of religiosity, the more you struggle with some mental health symptoms if you live in a secular culture, or if you live in an individualistic culture, or if you experience a spiritual crisis, or when people confront you about your beliefs. However, if you live in a highly religious culture, you're less worried, you're less stressed, you're less depressed, you're less likely to engage in substance abuse, you're less likely to engage in all sorts of negative health behaviors. So now let's take all this research and stuff I haven't actually spoken about because I just don't have time and I don't want to waste your time. And let's talk about how it works in my adaptive group identification model. So again, the three components by which I judge how adaptive something is for your identity or to identify with is how much harm does it cause to yourself, how much harm does this identity thing cause to other people, and then how much does it make your life more effective, less effective, does it make it easier to work and live in the world. So with regard to harm to the self, in many ways, it seems like being more highly identified with your religion means protecting against unhealthy behaviors, like I said earlier. However, it has mixed results for health behaviors like eating right and obesity and exercise, and very negative results for open-mindedness and critical thinking. Moreover, there's a lot of mixed results in the research for physical health overall with people and religiosity, with many studies pointing to the idea that religious people in highly religious environments are fairly healthy, whereas not in secularist environments, and vice versa. There's also one study that found that atheists were on average healthier and less often diagnosed with mental illnesses. I think that's fascinating. Religion tends to result in less daily stress and higher subjective well-being, which is, according to the research, theoretically due to this concept of surrender to God. Basically, that having a community that supports you and believes like you, and having an all-powerful being who has your back at all times, puts you at ease, which makes sense. And in most Western countries, highly religious people tend to live longer. So what you can see here is that there's kind of a mixed bag with regard to harm to self. Being highly religious has some downside, and also has a fair amount of upside. Harm to others. Now this is, again, another chance for you to take something I'm saying and call me either racist or prejudiced or anti-Islamic or whatever you want to say. Go for it. That's totally fine by me. So again, with regard to the second concept of adaptive group identification, how much your identity causes harm to others or kind of encourages you to cause harm to others, depending upon what culture you live in, it can make you more violent or less violent. So if you're a highly identified Christian in the US, you're less likely to be violent. If you're a highly identified Muslim of some sort in Iran, Iraq, any number of places, chances of you being violent are pretty good, right? So there's this culture-dependent effect with regard to harm to others. So if you live in the 4.5 million square mile area from basically, the far side of India over to Tunisia, and from Turkey down to basically Somalia, that kind of square-ish area where Islam, Judaism, and Christianity are fighting and have been fighting it out for years. If you're highly religious in that area, you're more likely to engage in violence and even condone violence and say, go for it. However, if you live in more Western countries and you're highly religious, you're less likely to engage in violence, right? So again, it's a mixed bag. Being highly religious, highly identifying with your religion in terms of causing harm to others is a mixed bag. It's really culturally dependent, And finally, the third category of adaptive group identification, does it make your life more effective? Does it allow you to function more effectively? So in highly religious environments, it seems like being highly religious actually allows you to function much better. However, if you live in more secular or more individualistic cultures, scoring highly on measures of religiosity means you're more likely to fight about your religion, you're more likely to decompensate when people challenge you, and you're more likely to have stress and anxiety and depression. So, again, slightly mixed bag, but again, if you come from one of the many areas on the planet where there's strong emphasis on religion, or even, there's research that's done in the US that goes county by county and shows that those highly religious people in those counties, in those states, do better in those counties, whereas highly religious people in the county next door where they're not very religious don't do as well. So it really is a culture and context dependent thing. So this is my talk on religion. I look forward to all sorts of kind of comments or critiques or whatever. I believe I have spoken as clearly and honestly as I can. If anyone has any kind of disagreement or thinks I've misrepresented something or am misinterpreting something, please let me know. It's a sad fact that, you know, we can't have an honest discussion about these things, but I'm trying right now. And I want you all to take the facts that I've stated here as facts, not opinions, not assertions. These are facts. And I've taken these facts and I've made my three-part argument about how adaptive it is to identify with your religion. So basically the sum of it is, if you live in a highly religious environment and no one's ever going to challenge you, go for it. Be highly religious. However, if you live in the US, for instance, in other parts of Europe and Asia where there's more secular kind of mindset spreading, being highly religious is not going to work for you. You can have a belief in God, you can have a belief in spirituality or something, but being highly rigidly religious, over-identifying with your religion like it's the most important thing in the world, doesn't seem to work. And again, I'll make the same argument I made at the last video, which is, aren't we a little more complex as creatures than just our religious identity? Isn't there something slightly more important about life than just how we see ourselves in terms of religion? Whether, and I hear this all the time in videos when, if you listen to people like Sam Harris speak or other atheists, they're like, I don't walk around all day thinking I don't believe in God, you know, which is weird, right? Like, people might walk around all day thinking I'm a Christian or I'm a Jew or I'm a Muslim or whatever, but it has nothing to do with who they really are as people, how they function on a day-to-day basis. So the common atheist rebuttal is, well, why would I walk around all day thinking I don't believe in God? Like, that's something about who I am. It's just a thing. It's this very small, insignificant thing, right? We're much more complex as creatures than that. So wouldn't it make more sense to just focus on the vast, broad, complicated picture of who we are as creatures and not really focus on the religious identity? I mean, it's the same argument I made last week about race. Yeah, it's always staring you in the face. No different than religion is probably always staring you in the face. But is it really all that important to focus on and make the biggest piece of the pie? I don't think so. But that's just me. So I hope this has been informative in some way, shape, or form. I hope that at least the facts resonate with you, even if my opinion about how adaptive it is, I'd say it's mixed in terms of its adaptive value. I hope it's useful, and I look forward to seeing you all again next weekend when I come back with the final and fourth part of this series about politics. I will be discussing how important is it to identify with your political tribe. And I will probably be coming back with a very similar opinion. It kind of depends, but not really. Which is the point of my book, The Fear Problem, coming out October 2nd. Thank you again to Mascot Books. And, you know, there's so much more conversation to have, but that's enough for today. I hope you all have a good Sunday and a good week. And I look forward to speaking with you again in a week.